with editing later. There we go. All right.
All right.
So welcome, Paul. We sent out your bio earlier, so I won't repeat it. And you have some information here on this first slide. I'll let you introduce yourself, but we're so happy to have you here. If folks have questions, I'll be monitoring the chat to help out with that. So feel free to put your questions in there, or I think Paul said you're happy to have people interject as we go too. So
yeah,
you, Paul.
sure. Thanks, Jennifer. Well, good to see all you folks virtually. This was kind of an exciting opportunity for me because I hadn't really talked about Waldo Lake in a long time, and it's always been a special place for me since probably since the late 1970s, actually, is when I first was exposed to Waldo. So I'm hoping this talk kind of gives you some context about a little bit about the lake, its history, how it was formed, the geology a little bit, and the pre-contact period, and some of the events that occurred in the early and mid 20th century that could have rendered Waldo Lake a very different place. And then some of the things that have happened in the last 20 years that have improved the quality for you paddlers. So with that, and I assume the slides looking okay. It's all okay. We're gonna go to the next one then, and let's see here. Now, hang on a sec.
I think, Paul, if you hover your mouse in your lower left-hand corner, it looked like there was some faint arrows that had popped up. Maybe if you click.
Yeah, it's I don't know what it's. There we go.
Yeah, and now if you hover over into the left, there's a forward.
Yeah,
there you go.
My mouse has been acting up too. So you know, it's kind of an interesting. In fact, I was skiing the other day, and it was a nice clear day before we got the clouds again. And so I was on the top of Mount Bachelor, and I always like looking over and looking at Waldo Lake from there. And it's, you know, the angle is not great. You can see parts of it, and I've always been curious about, well, how was this lake formed? You know, and so there's in the geologic literature, there was kind of debate about, well, is it part of a fault scarp or was it glacially formed? And it appears that, you know, primarily the current thinking is at least that it was definitely glacially formed, and there's remnant glacial features on some of the mountains to the south of Waldo Lake, and then there's some on the east side, and there's also a potential fault scarp, and that may have helped sort of orient the path of the glacier, so it probably moved from south to north and carved out this basin. So in reality, it's not that old. You know, it probably is on the order of, you know, less than 20,000 years old. It might be as young as 12,000 years old. So, which is kind of interesting, you know, and it's one of the largest freshwater lakes in Oregon, and it's also one of the most pure in terms of its water. And I'm going to pause a second here because my notes are not showing up. So let me just do something really quick here. It's not advancing. Weird.
You need to stop screen sharing for a second and get it.
No, I can figure that out. We'll figure a workaround. So anyway, some of you may be fairly familiar with, you know, the Cascades in Oregon. They're roughly 35 million years old. You know, there's the old Cascade, the Western Cascades, then there's the newer Cascades, which are the current peaks that we see today, you know, Hood, Jefferson, the Three Sisters, et cetera. And then by just south of Waldo, you would have other volcanoes trending down towards Northern California. The deposits in and around Waldo have been dated around 13 to 17 million years. So this area has definitely been affected by plate tectonics. That's what's created this uplift. And then more recently, you have glaciation that occurred, the most recent one in the last, 700,000 years ago to about 12,000 years ago. Series of glacial periods, glaciation, retreat, glaciation, retreat. And then the volcanoes to the south of Waldo, such as Fuji, Mount Ray, what's the other one? Cupid Mary, I think. Those are all, show evidence of glaciation. So it's quite convincing to me, at least, that it's a glacially formed lake. So let's go to the next one here. And this, and these, I can see why paddlers love this lake. I mean, that's what really attracted me to the lake. I was working, my first job with the Forest Service as an archaeologist was on the former Oak Ridge Ranger District. It's now called the Middle Fork Ranger District of the Willamette National Forest. And Waldo Lake was part of our management area on the district. So it was something I got exposed to fairly early in my career, and it was always fun to be able to spend a little time up there. The views are just spectacular. So there's, in Waldo, we know there's probably at least 8,000 years of pre-contact history, Native American, Aboriginal, Indigenous use of the area. More recently, in the 19th century, Judge Waldo, for whom the lake was named, sung its praises after he frequented the Cascades in the summer for health and wellness. Talk a little bit about that. It's Oregon's second purest ultra oligotrophic lake, following Crater Lake as number one. There's no surface water input. It's all fed by snowmelt and springs. And we almost lost this natural treasure that we all enjoy due to our collective hubris in the early 20th century. Still having mouse issues here, sorry. So I guess to think about like the pre-contact history. So, when did people first discover Waldo Lake? Well, we have to go back. Well, when did people first come to the Americas? And there's a lot of debate about that. Did they cross an ice age land bridge when so much during our glacial period, when so much of the Earth's surface waters were tied up in glaciers, Siberia and Alaska were connected by land. So people could have walked. So that's one hypothesis. Another hypothesis that's gaining more traction is, well, why didn't they just paddle the Kelp Highway? They could have left Kamchatka, Siberia, Japanese islands, what have you, and just paddled around the rim of the Pacific. And some of the earliest dates of occupation are prior to this land bridge really being open and available. So there's some early sites in the Channel Islands off of California. There's early sites down in Chile that date, 13 to 15,000 years ago. So I think there's a strong likelihood that your organization probably represents the same type of transportation use that the first Americans may have used to leave Asia and arrive on the North American continent. Go a little bit more into some dates in a sec. So here's a graphic.
There's a question why we might be assuming it was uninhabited and then had people come to this area.
Yeah, there's no evidence of previous habitation in the Americas, north or south, prior to at least right now around 15,000 years ago. There's some earlier sites dated in parts of South America and parts of North America that are highly debatable as if they're accurate. They're not scientifically agreed upon as early dates, but clearly, if we arrived, well, let me put it this way: we all come from Africa. And so when we were migrating out of Africa, populating Asia, Eurasia, Europe, and eventually the Americas, all that was happening, as much as from 2 million years ago to a few 100,000 years ago. So the Americas was kind of like the final frontier. And the people in in what we now consider Siberia, that part of Asia, were the ancestors of the peoples that populated the Americas. And we know that from DNA studies, looking at human remains and comparing their genomes with those from parts of Asia. And there's some potential connection with Polynesia as well. And the reason this whole hypothesis about potential paddles, which this graphic kind of shows you some potential routes that these migrations would have occurred. And so, there's you'll see where it says Paisley Cave. Well, that's in Oregon, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the University of Oregon's work there has now demonstrated that that's one of the earliest sites in the continental United States and North America in general. And it's over 14,000 years old. It's quite likely that their ancestors probably arrived here through paddling on rafts or boats. We know that it's not a new phenomena to we humans, because Australia was also populated very early, much earlier, 50,000 years ago, from South Asia. And the only way they could have gotten there was by a raft or a boat of some kind. They couldn't have walked. So the idea of travel by water was probably known to some, at least, and passed on to our advantage. Anyway, Paisley Caves is kind of interesting. For those of you who are interested in pre-contact history, the Central Oregon, the Archaeological Society of Central Oregon, the Oregon Archaeological Society out of Portland, and then also Dennis Jenkins and his colleagues at the University of Oregon, Eugene, have given several presentations about Paisley Caves, and some of those you can go online, and they're recorded like this one would be, and so you can learn a little bit more about how they discovered Paisley Caves. And it was discovered very early by Luther Cressman in the 30s, some excavations done, and then a lot more work in the last 15 years, really exploring that cave and systematic excavation, and then finding human coprolites, fossilized species, of which you can extract DNA from. And so they were able to figure out what they're eating, like camels and prehistoric camels and other ungulates, but also the DNA strands that were extracted. So, but that's a whole other lecture. I don't want to get too bogged down in that, but good question, just on dates. So let's go to the next one here. Glaciers, as I mentioned, are starting to retreat by about 12,000 years ago. That's what the YBP means, is years before present. We did some archaeological work at Waldo Lake. It's another potential paddle, but it's a little windier. I used to windsurf on that lake, and it's definitely windier, and there are boats, so there's another issue. That said, we did some assays of sediments in marsh bog type situations where they're essentially anaerobic. So we wanted to go and pull cores out of them to see if we could look at the succession of plant pollens and fragments back through time. And by doing that, working with specialists outside of the area, we were able to determine that, by 8,000 years ago, there really weren't conifer forests as we know them today. It was still kind of more like subalpine type vegetation. There was that common juniper, which is more of a shrub component in the alpine, and grasses. And so the conifer forests really hadn't established themselves yet. So we're still in that early post-glacial times. And as I mentioned earlier, other areas of Oregon where we think the earliest occupations were somewhere between 13 and 15,000 years ago. And we know in more recent times, ethnographically, anthropologists and settlers, others noticing and working with tribes that they were harvesting wolcus seeds, pond lily seeds, with dugout canoes. So if they didn't paddle here, they were using paddling as part of their economic sustenance to harvest foods. And the Klamath are the lake people. And we know there is some evidence that the Klamath passed through this area of Waldo onto their trading both north and probably over into the Willamette Valley as well.
Well, there's a question of where are the Paisley caves?
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, who hasn't been to the famous Paisley Mosquito Festival? It's a must miss if you don't like mosquitoes. But so if you continue on Highway 31, leaving south of Lapine off Highway 97 towards Lakeview, you will pass through the town of Paisley after you leave Summer Lake. And it's a beautiful drive in that high desert, northern Great Basin context. Fort Rock is nearby. It's another great place to visit. Silver Lake and Paisley Caves is just north of the town of Paisley on basalt rim rock, basically. So back to canoes and paddling. One really interesting side note with regards to dugout canoes is on the Deschutes side, which the divide of the Cascades separates the Deschutes National Forest from the Willamette. So Waldo's on the Willamette. Davis Lake, just a little bit east, is on the Deschutes. And it's like south of Crane Prairie and southwest of Wickiup, for those you know the area. Anyway, Davis Lake is fairly shallow, and it's more popular with fishermen. It's definitely not a motorboat lake. Not much paddling that I'm aware of. But anyway, we discovered there were 2 dugout canoes buried in this lake. When we had low lake water in the 1980s, they were discovered. There's an outlet of the lake that's actually, the lake was formed by a lava flow. And so it's fairly porous. And there's this big sinkhole near the lava bed where the water drains and heads north. And one of these canoes was just pitched right in this sinkhole. And it was pretty interesting. They were both carved out of ponderosa pine logs. And Davis Lake is very shallow. It's very biologically productive. So it was probably very useful to leave canoes there on their rounds of harvesting and collecting foods, to go out and collect some pond lily seeds and whatever else, some fishing maybe, or what have you. So kind of fascinating to find something like that from, probably they were a couple hundred years old, as I recall, from the early 1800s.
What happened with them? You left them there, or did they get brought up?
One was left and buried deeper into the muck, because once you expose something that's been water saturated for centuries,
Mhm.
If you take it up and expose it, it's going to dry out, and once it dries out, it'll turn to dust eventually.
Wow.
And one was recovered, and they did some dating on it, and it was stored in a warehouse, and that warehouse burnt down, and it took the canoe with it.
That's too bad.
Yeah, that's kind of a sad tale, that's for sure. Okay, let's see, where am I? So the difference with Waldo, if we compare that with, say, Davis, is it's a pure lake in the sense that there's not a lot, if any, of aquatic food resources that would have required the investment in making a dugout canoe for any activity. But that said, when was the lake first visited? And we just don't know. There's not any evidence that would definitively tell us that, on such and such a date in a year, or what have you, that the first Native American laid their eyes on the lake. But we know that there are archaeological sites in the vicinity of the lake and around the lake, and like South Waldo is one area. And if you've ever hiked around that area from Shadow Bay, there's an old not guard station, but trail shelter. And there's also an archaeological site there that's just probably a temporary hunting camp or a travel way. There is evidence of like maintaining obsidian toolkits, possibly related to not just hunting, but maybe also collecting of foods and medicines from the forest. But it doesn't appear to have been a real concentrated area of use. So it's probably very transitory in pre-contact times. There wasn't a lot of access either. It's not easy to get to, and the season was fairly short. So that would definitely limit people's access to the area. And then with the mosquito population, I'm sure that was a universal issue, whether you were living 500 years ago or in the present. So a little bit of Oregon history, which probably most of you already know as much as you need to, or it's more than I. Who knows? But you've got the Lewis and Clark expedition, and again, use of boats and paddling, rowing, etc. Was definitely part of their journey through parts of their trail and travel through what became known as the Oregon Territory, and particularly the Columbia River, which must have been pretty exciting. And then Fort Astoria was founded in 1811 by John Jacob Astor of the American Fur Company, another wealthy individual. And then there was a lot of Hudson Bay company involvement in the Oregon Territory from the English side. So it was kind of a common use area between the United States and England. And there was also Russian presence from Alaska, trading all the way down into Northern California. So there was a lot of international interest in what is this Pacific Northwest, and what's this great river of the West, and is there a Northwest Passage that allows commerce and transportation to open up the territory. And that was partly why President Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark on their Corps of Discovery. The Joint Occupation Treaty of 1818 between the United States and England kind of allowed for that joint administration. It was mostly by the Hudson Bay Company out of Fort Vancouver, just across the river from Portland. And that's a great place to visit if you haven't been. The National Park Service has done a great job interpreting that site. There were There was English, French Canadians, Hawaiians, Native Americans. It was a very multicultural spot, even in the early 1800s. With the Oregon Trail commencing about 1846 and continuing until almost 1870, the whole establishment of the Willamette Valley as a prime destination for homesteading was really facilitated by the Homestead Act, which was passed in 1848. And that allowed for tracts of land to be occupied by yeoman farmers who would prove up on the land and build their facilities and develop an economy, et cetera. So we had a lot of people moving across the Oregon Trail at that time. By the late 1800s, most of the prime lands in Western Oregon were taken up. And then at that point, by the late 1800s, you had people settling in central and eastern Oregon, which they had passed through on the Oregon Trail, came back. Land's a little different, soils are different, climate's different, but it was good for ranching. And so sheep and cattle ranching kind of took hold. Prineville was founded in 1877, and all the other communities kind of developed from that point on. Let's see here. Let's get to Mr. Waldo, or Judge Waldo, as we should call him. So I like to think of Judge Waldo as Oregon's John Muir. He was a state Supreme Court justice. He became the Chief Justice. He was, prior to that, a state legislator. He was an outdoorsman, but he had health issues. And, what was common in the late 1800s and early 1900s was the belief that outdoor living, sunshine, fresh air, extreme in temperatures, just would invigorate and bring people back to health. They'd get out of their stuffy boardrooms, get away from too much cigar and cigarette smoke and heavy drinking, and confined to real dusty, confined parlors in their Victorian houses, et cetera. And so he would summer in the Cascades. And being a little bit wealthy, he could afford to do that in the summer. And he could afford to hire people who would hunt and fish with him, kind of act as guides and packers and all that. So there's a little bit of privilege involved in that kind of outdoor life in those days. In 1888, Waldo and 4 others traveled by horseback from Mount Jefferson down to Shasta. And he introduced a memorial to Congress to establish a forest preserve in Oregon from border to border. And through the early 1900s, he continued to advocate for the forest reserves, and ultimately, along with William Steele, the creation of Crater Lake National Park. So he was pretty instrumental in preserving areas and creating what we now benefit from in terms of the public lands under national forests and national parks, particularly in the Cascades. And then I don't know how well this really comes across. Wasn't a great map to begin with visually, but it was drawn up by cartographers in about 1863. You can see where in the Willamette Valley there's lots of plot, a lot of survey had been done for homesteading, and the areas around Ben's over here, and then where Waldo Lake is just says Virgin Lakes. So it may have not been that well known even in 1863 that there was some big lakes up there. There were probably people weren't really exploring because there were not easy ways to get through. At some point, these virgin lakes became known, at least this particular large one became known as Waldo Lake. And we don't have a lot of information on who named it and how it got named for Waldo. If was there, or if it was just common use at the time, and it just became official. So that's about all I know. But now I want to move into some of the trends that were occurring in the 19th century that led to a period of time where places like Waldo Lake may have been, in my view, adversely affected by development. So the whole efforts of the reclamation movement really got started in the after the Civil War, with the idea that, you know, there's all this arid land in the West. You live in Western states, they have all this arid land. We got all these people we want to settle, we want to develop our economies. You know, we've got all this water going to waste. It's just going down the river into the ocean, and you know, let's make some use of it. So there was this really utilitarian view about water, and you know, if we can bring the plow to land, the clouds will just follow us, and rain will come, and it'll become like a breadbasket. So there was all this like mythology about, you know, bring human intervention and economic interest into an area, and the water will just follow the plow. You know, it'll just become a paradise. As long as we can like tap lakes and rivers and irrigate. So fortunately, there were a few people involved, like Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot were both well-known conservationists. They weren't preservationists like John Muir, and maybe not like Judge Waldo. They still believed that there was a way to do both conserving natural resources and then benefiting from them economically, which was in contrast to some of the folks that were also in the Department of Interior at the time. The Forest Service was originally in the Department of Interior, and that was seen as a very corrupt agency because the Interior was well known to be just, you know, follow the money. So whoever had the money, you know, Interior would meet their needs. And so Pinchot and Roosevelt, working with Frederick Newell, formed the Reclamation Service to try and keep control of water in the federal purview, and not just turn it over to private development completely. So the whole idea of like irrigation, you know, building dams, diverting and creating reservoirs, digging canals, and then diverting the water, and basically agricultural engineering. You know, like the Central Valley in California is a great example. And here in Central Oregon, you know, we've got at least 7 major irrigation districts and thousands of miles of canal that come off of the Deschutes River primarily. You know, and so there was interest in dam building, creating reservoirs, and then with the emergence of technology around electric power generation through hydropower, it's like, oh, we can also generate, you know, electricity and revenue. And so there was a lot of interest in that was beginning to come to fruition in this reclamation movement. And they had, every year there would be an annual irrigation congress. And these congresses would really promote like opportunities for business and farming and developing local economies around the management of water. Excuse me. So as you go down I-5 in California, which I'm doing tomorrow, I always marvel at the signs along the I-5 about, you know, wasting water, and Governor Newsom ought to, like, you know, create more dams, all that kind of stuff. And so there's always been this push, the water's just being wasted, so what that it's, harboring aquatic life, such as, anadromous fish like salmon and other species, etc. But the whole idea is like, don't waste this water. And so there was really a big debate within this whole movement about, should private enterprise be the lead in managing water, or should it be the federal or state governments? And what happened in the late 1800s is the Carey Act was passed in 1894 that gave the states control over reclamation and irrigation. But there was also a big role for the federal government in the reclamation service, and then also the Army Corps of Engineers. So there wasn't as much, there was still some private investment and private involvement, but it was primarily, government at that time. But states could enter into contracts with private corporations to develop irrigation projects. And that's kind of what leads us to what happened to Waldo Lake, or what didn't happen to Waldo Lake. So if you've paddled up in Waldo Lake, have any of you gone up as far as like the North Waldo area where this North Waldo cut is? Maybe. If not, yay. Well, anyway, there was in 1903, the Department of Interior was writing a report on sort of the economic and natural resource, the natural resource values and the potential economic values in the Cascades. And then there was a mention of Waldo Lake as a potential natural reservoir. And then by 1905, a gentleman by A.R. Black and fellow speculators filed for water rights on Waldo Lake. And they appropriated 100,000 acre feet of water under Oregon law and applied for a special use permit with the Forest Service that had just been created that very year in 1905. And then this canal that they dug to control the natural outlet of Waldo Lake, which flows into the North Fork of the Middle Fork of the Willamette, became known as the Black Cut. So the idea in 1905 was to drain this appropriated water out of the Waldo, and on the way down to irrigating farms in the Willamette Valley and parts between the Cascades and the Willamette Valley, you'd also run it through penstocks into turbines for electric power generation. So they had grandiose plans in 1905, if you can believe that. And it was perfectly legal. Let's see. So here's a schematic of the Waldo Lake reservoir, which you can see on the far right of the slide, and then potential irrigated farmlands in Lane County in the Upper Willamette Valley. And for those of you who live in the Willamette Valley, which I assume it sounds like besides Portland, a few of you do, you'll know that despite the wet weather, summers are dry. And, the idea was, well, we could provide year-round, or at least when there's in the dry season, agricultural lands could be potentially irrigated by Waldo Lake. So a lot of words on this one, sorry. So there was, so this A.R. Black hires this engineer called Simon Clovedall, who was out of Eugene, to really develop this natural reservoir. And During that time in the early 1900s, this gentleman, Mr. Black, continued to kind of fight with the Forest Service and the state of Oregon over the fees he was required to pay, and the facts that he kept delaying construction and improvements, and so he wasn't really demonstrating beneficial use, which was a criteria for a permit. You had to actually have a benefit. You just couldn't do it for the sake of engineering. And he was kind of considered more of a speculator. So I think he was kind of trying to promote this as an opportunity so he could sell it to someone else, which is in fact what he did in 1908. And so the interest went to a gentleman by the name of Ray, who then incorporated the Waldo Lake Irrigation and Power Company. And then Simon Klovedal at that time is retained by the new corporation to develop in full this new reservoir. And there's Mr. Klovedal. I had fun digging around the Lane County Historical Society years and years ago, learning more about Simon Klovedal, and I was able to talk to one of his granddaughters. So that was kind of neat. And here he is in his Eugene City office. And let's see. So this Waldo Lake Irrigation and Power Company tried to develop, this natural reservoir and their hydropower generation plants, and it wasn't until 1909 that they realized that, well, rather than using this canal at the north end, there's this narrow ridge that separates the lake from the upper parts of Black Creek and Salmon Creek. And so they came up with this scheme that they were going to tap into the lake by drilling a tunnel from west to east and creating a head gate from which they could control the flow of water out of the lake. And so all this started happening in 1909, continued through 1914. And this is a very remote location. So Simon Klovedal and his crews had to build trails up Salmon Creek and access this area initially, but they also had to build a road basically connecting from the railhead at Shaniko, Oregon, which was the closest railhead in Central Oregon, and then freight their equipment to what was a little town of Bend, and then basically go cross country on wagons up to Waldo. And if you've ever driven from the east side up into Waldo, that road is still extremely rough. And so it wasn't easy to get to, and they had a short working season. And but despite all that, they were able to construct a 370-foot tunnel and build a head gate of concrete. And that is what I'll show you next. And that's what you can go. Oh, this is a picture of their work camp, building their log cabins for their construction camp on the shores of Waldo. And just imagine keeping a crew happy and fed and supplied with the right equipment. I mean, this was not an easy task in the early 1900s with no actual roads. And I apologize, this picture should have turned out better, but they dewatered the area of the lake in front of what would become the tunnel head gates. And this is just a picture of the construction crew happily excavating and probably waiting for their paycheck. And this is what the head gates look like under construction in 1913. And I assume with you paddlers that have been to Waldo, you've already seen this head gate. So this is what it looked like over 100 years ago.
Paul, I'm two things. I'm just noticing that there's about 11 minutes left of the official presentation time, so just want to have that known. what does it mean to de-water? What does that process look like? Like, you don't have a dam to hold back the water. How did they get the water away to build the dam?
They build what is called a cofferdam, which is just a temporary dam to dewater. Rock and timber, soil, whatever could be brought just to drain and then drain the water out, maybe with pumps or what have you. And so they actually can pour the concrete and do all the work they had to do, because they hadn't, they weren't able to pour concrete in water yet. So I'll kind of pass through some of this stuff a little quickly. Just basically, the company was still getting a lot of negative press in the local papers, the Oregonian, the Register Card. They couldn't get enough capital. They couldn't get the markets to sell the power or the irrigation. And, they just felt like they were a bunch of speculators. And ultimately, like, the local farmers in the Willamette Valley got together and formed the Anti-Bonding Irrigation League, because they didn't want to have to end up footing the bill for this kind of a scheme. So that kind of put the kibosh on the whole thing, fortunately. So corporate activity pretty much ceased, before 1920. And Mr. Klovedal kind of leaves and goes on to do road building and civil engineering for the city of Eugene. There's an effort to restart the project in the late 1920s, and there's plans for more power plants, but those don't come to fruition either. And with the stock market crash of 1929, there was just no more work being done up there. And then the Forest Service finally pulled their actual special use permit to occupy and run their plant at Waldo in the mid-30s. And so the final blow is really the Depression and then World War II. Fortunately, there were other trends happening in the United States, and I'm just going to go quickly here. But recreation was becoming an important social. Sorry, that's my slide here. The idea that recreation was good for the community, it's good for the individual and family, and it's good to get outdoors. So there was this whole movement of outdoor recreation. And then after World War II, you've got like the boom in the family automobile is becoming very reliable compared to what it was in the pre-Depression era. And so people had a little bit more time and in some cases money. And so there was, a little bit a different interest in the natural environment, and particularly in terms of recreation in this area in the high Cascades. So amenity values were competing fairly strongly with utilitarian values. And the 1964 Wilderness Act is, and other acts like the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, et cetera, really, emphasized where society was at with regards to, values of recreation and natural beauty, et cetera. So Waldo Basin was designated by the Forest Service as a limited use area in the 40s. There was some early 1950 efforts when the Willamette Basin Project was in development by the Army Corps. They were looking at new reservoir locations, and they were considering maybe throwing Waldo into that, but there was enough public interest in preserving it as is, including the Forest Service, that never came to fruition either. And by the 1950s, there was local highway access nearby Waldo, so it was a little bit easier to get into. And by the early 1960s, the Forest Service developed the Waldo Lake Recreation Plan. So they established an advisory council, they worked with community members, and ultimately developed a road that came in on the east side of the lake, and then a series of campgrounds rather, Shadow Bay, Islet, and North Waldo, and then boat docks and all the other trails, etc. So there was a real effort to develop it as a recreation resource. There was talk about developing a visitor center and resorts, options for more commercial activities related to recreation. But I think the mosquito issue was probably putting somewhat of a damper on that. And there were already other resorts nearby at Odell, for example, or Crescent. Sorry, I'm just rushing through here, trying to keep on schedule.
It's okay, Paul. You don't have to rush. I just wanted to know. I mean,
Yeah,
people will stick around. I'm sure it's interesting, but also just
yeah. No, it's getting close to 8, so I understand. So by the late 1950s, the dam was beginning to leak again, and working in those remote locations in the early 1900s, getting a really good quality product of concrete from sifting sand locally and mixing it with Portland cement and all that kind of stuff. They just couldn't get a good concrete. And so ultimately, time, weather, and just wear and tear allowed the gates to start leaking. So there was real concern about what would happen to the lake. And I know that there was an estimate at one time that if all the gates had been opened and they drained their allotted water, the lake level would drop by at least 25 feet. And it would take a couple of decades to fill. So it's not a reservoir that was that sustainable, because it's all spring fed, and it's really going back to its glacial period. It's somewhat of an artifact of the glacier that used to be there. So 1960, the Forest Service, working with scuba divers, applied concrete patches on the lakeside of the dam. By the 1980s, the leakage had returned significantly. And this is myself and an engineer, Dave Nordenson. We're inside the tunnels, and coming from the west up Black Creek, and then ultimately they created a patch or of concrete on the interior of the tunnel. So building the forms on the west side of the gates, and then opening an adit to the top where a helicopter could then hover and pour concrete in and seal it completely. So that's what we did in around 1987. And there's the head gates on the left there that you're all pretty familiar with, probably. There's a schematic of the tunnel where the head gates are, and this is where we poured the concrete. It's right in here. So it should last a while, because we'd hate to lose Waldo Lake. So back to Waldo Lake's purity and clarity. One of the things that really keeps it pure was it just wasn't getting a lot of use. But like once the Forest Service developed campgrounds and boat ramps, you had people, with their motorboats and fishing, and there's not a lot of fish in Waldo. There's no natural fish; it's all stocked, or it was. And so water quality became sort of a concern, because previously it was ultra oligotrophic, which is, it's a very pure lake and very clear. That's why you can see quite incredible depths in the lake. But it was beginning to change a little bit, and so there was concerns of water quality, and so ultimately conflicts also with paddlers, sailors, and people in non-motorized uses were conflicting with those in in motorboats, even though there was a speed limit. There still were enough conflicts where there was enough public interest that the Forest Service revisited the whole issue in the 2000s and then issued a decision in 2007 that removed motorboats, motor-powered boats from the lake. So that was something that I think really helped make an improvement to the lake and ultimately will help the water quality. It's a funny story. When I was working on that district, I spent a little bit of time as one of the assistants to the district ranger, like the recreation staff, I guess was the term. And I get this phone call from this gentleman out of Eugene who wants to fly his float plane and land in Waldo Lake. And this was like in 86, I think, or something like that, 87. And we'd already reduced the speed limit to 10 miles an hour. So I told him, if you can land at under 10 miles an hour, you're more than welcome to drop your float plane on the lake. But if you come in and exceed that, it's no good. He wasn't happy with that answer, and I'm sure he went to his congressman. That's probably why I left that job. But I've never seen a float plane land on Waldo Lake. So I'm going to skip over this slide real quick. You know, the whole thing on phytoplankton, water quality, we can get into when we're maybe on the lake. So the decision in 1907 basically restricts the use of internal combustion engines. So you can still have electric motors, but I'm sure there's a few sailboats out there that might have electric motors. The times I've been there, I've just seen paddlers. So that's a good thing. So I think the proof will be in how the clarity of the lake is retained over time, and there are people actively studying lake clarity and publishing their results, and so hopefully we can enjoy it, and the water quality will continue to be you know, as good as it is and has been over the years. So with that, I'm kind of at the end of that piece. So I'm going to stop my sharing.
Thanks, Paul. There's a question about Odell Lake and wondering if it has a similar mosquito population or situation that Waldo does.
You know, it does have some mosquitoes, but it's nothing near the just the issue I've seen at Waldo. And I think it's partly the topography around Odell and the prevalent winds, because it's on the east side of the crest and it's usually just blowing. You know, you get strong afternoon winds. The time at which you get a lot of mosquitoes out, like at Waldo in the late, you know, mid to late afternoon, right before sunset. At Odell, the winds blowing hard enough where it doesn't seem to be as much of an issue. And then around Waldo, there's so many wet areas that are perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes that it just seems to be more concentrated. Yeah. And it seems to be more of an issue on the west side of the Cascades, less on the east side.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. There's one more question here. Oh, there's another one. Did the tunnel ever transport water to Black Creek?
Not to our knowledge. I'm sure there was a test run where, you know, once they completed the tunnel and had everything buttoned up and they had the valves installed and their gate valves where you turn this wheel and open up the gates, they probably tested those and let water run out. Mm-hmm. But because they were never able to develop the economics behind it and get support for either power or irrigation, yeah, water really never flowed out of it in a consistent way.
I'm just going to remind people, if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat, or you could come off mute and ask it. And there's one in here from Cloudy, and I had to Google what you were asking about, Cloudy. And if you want to come off mute to ask your question, it looks like you're asking about the water lilies and wondering about the names of Wokus and Nufer Lantanum. My Latin names aren't there. Cloudy, are you here? It looks like. Oh, maybe Cloudy's left.
But the Klamath relied heavily on Wokus seeds, and that's what they often would use their dugout canoes for. Also, like, you know, waterfowl hunting. But typically, you know, the women were in the dugouts collecting seeds and other aquatic plants potentially.
Great.
Could I ask a question, please? Can
Please
you hear
do.
me?
Yeah.
I can hear you.
That thing about the guy with the float plane. As I recall, the Oregonian covered that quite a bit, and I couldn't remember exactly where it was, when it was, but you indicated it was in the mid 80s, and that makes sense. But as I recall, he claimed that he and his family went up there every year with their float plane, and now they were being told they had to stop. And so my first question is my recollection correct? And then my second question about that is, he pursued that quite a bit and appealed it or something. And was that eventually, and you're right, I think he lost those, but was that eventually resolved in front of the Forest Service, or was it resolved in front of the Marine Board?
You know, that's a really good question, because typically it would be the Marine Board. It's kind of a, you know, it's both a Marine Board, a state issue, but also a federal issue because of the lands. So the Forest Service had already established a speed limit on the lake. So, you know, previously, my assumption would be that his family, you know, legally could land a float plane, because the speed limit was, maybe there was no speed limit, or it was 25. I don't really know. But yeah, once the Forest Service established a speed limit, then it makes, you know, float plane use a little bit out of character. And I don't recall articles in the Oregonian, but now I'm curious. I'll have to go back and see if I can dig those up from their website.
Did this guy claim that he and his family had been doing it every year for several years, and now they all of a sudden had to stop? Is my memory any good on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's my recollection. You know, he was not really happy with me because it was something that he'd done before, and he didn't go into all the detail that I recall. But you know, it wasn't his first rodeo landing a plane on Waldo.
And last, I want to say this has been a fascinating talk, and I read your article, and your talk was even better than your article. And so, thank you. I really enjoyed it. It's a fascinating subject.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
And Paul, along those lines, there's a question if there's a book or booklet that can tell us more. And I put a link to your, I guess it's not a book, but your article that we had linked in the email. Is there any other thing that you would recommend people read?
You know, there really isn't anything that I'm aware of in a book form, specifically about Waldo, but there's a couple of other pamphlets and, I don't know, books, using a loose term maybe, that are out there. One is, there's a history of the Willamette National Forest, and it was written by a gentleman by the name of Rakestraw, Rakestra. And I'm not sure how available that is anymore, but the Willamette National Forest would probably have a good idea. And then also the Middle Fork Ranger District on the Willamette, you know, has a small area of book sales, and they might have something like that. And then there were some local books written on the whole Oak Ridge, Upper Willamette area. I think Early Days on the Upper Willamette is one of them. And then there's a book about Cy Bingham, and he was an early forest ranger who became sheriff in Eastern Oregon later. But there's all these carved trees, a lot of them on the Willamette, but some on the Deschutes and elsewhere too, with his initials, and all from the early 1900s. And so there's a book written about Cy Bingham as well. Those are the only ones that really come to mind right now, at least in terms of history.
I've heard stories that Judge Waldo's family has his diaries.
Yes. Yes, and those diaries are available, I think, at some of the, they might be at the Knight Library in Eugene, at the University of Oregon. I know the Forest Service, when I was working, had copies of the diaries, and they're quite fascinating to read through, what I did in the summer of 1878. And it's pretty interesting to put yourself in those locations, over 125, 50 years ago, and some of the activities and the amount of fish that they were harvesting, where it's really hard to find any right now. And so anyway.
Well, I was able in the chat to find a PDF of that history of the Willamette National Forest. I don't know if it's the same one you were thinking of. Mm-hmm. And then it looks like Southern Oregon University maybe has part of those diaries digitized. And so I put a link for that in the chat as well. That's my
good. Oh, that's great.
Quick Googling. Yeah. There's probably better things out there, but if folks are interested, I'm going to stop the recording now. If folks have more questions, that's fine. But I know sometimes people don't want to ask them while it's being recorded. So I'm going to hit stop here.